Hey everyone, and welcome to the Cooper Cole podcast, where we delve into the practices of Canadian and international artists in conjunction with their exhibitions at our gallery. My name is Magdalyn Asimakis, and I'm the Director of Research and Artist Relations at Cooper Cole, a contemporary art gallery in Toronto, Canada that was founded in 2012. This episode features a conversation between myself and the San Antonio-based artist Daniel Rios Rodriguez. Rios Rodriguez's works are extensions of his context. The materials he uses are purchased or found in his immediate environment and often include found wood, stone, terracotta, glass, rope, and nails, in addition to paint and canvas. The works intentionally touch on disparate motifs from the history of painting, including landscape, still life, and self-portraiture. Rios Rodriguez's dreams, which he explains are mostly about landscapes, spill into his work as well, and imagery can veer into the fantastical and surreal. Rios Rodriguez received his BFA from the University of Illinois at Chicago and an MFA from Yale University. He was the recipient of the 2013 Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Award and has exhibited at galleries and museums internationally. Select gallery exhibitions include various small fires in Dallas, Curlin Gallery in Dublin, Camden Art Center in London, Nickel Bouchen Gallery in New York, Lulu in Mexico City, Hannah Hoffman Gallery in Los Angeles, and Martos Gallery in New York, among others. Select museum exhibitions include the San Antonio Museum of Art, the Palais de Tokyo, the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, and the McNay Art Museum. Daniel's current exhibition at Cooper Cole is presented in our East Gallery and includes 11 new paintings and 2 drawings. The works are brightly painted, range in scale and shape, and the smaller works are playfully hung at different heights. In his paintings, Daniel includes materials like wood, terracotta, rope, stones, and other found materials from his immediate environment. These materials are often painted and included in the imagery. The motifs in this series of paintings include shells, suns, birds and feathers, and symbolic landscapes in vibrant colors. We are recording this interview in conjunction with Daniel's exhibition Father Time, currently on view at Cooper Cole in our West Gallery until July 30th, 2022. So here it is. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Daniel. So nice to have you here and to be able to speak to you about this incredible new work of yours.
Thank you.
It might be helpful for those who are maybe just becoming familiar with your practice. If you could tell us a bit about it, just generally how you approach your work and how you've been working the last few years.
Let's see, where do I begin? That's funny. I was asking myself that question when I was driving here to my sister's apartment to do the recording. Like the question, where do I begin? Because it's not, I don't think it's very easy for me to kind of jump into, and maybe this is true for all artists, but it's very easy for me to kind of like jump into my own story of myself or the things that I tell myself rather than talking about the work. And I feel like because these things are kind of inseparable, I'm never really quite sure what is the appropriate place to start. You know how you see in those comedies, those movies where someone will ask how someone is doing, and then they suddenly just begin to unfold like a lifetime worth of stories, and the person would really just wanted to know how they were feeling in that moment.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like that's where I'm always at, is that how do I gauge like the level of like interest within a conversation about my work, and how much does it really have to do with me, because ultimately it's, my work is about me, and my work is about my family, my work is about the things that are closest to me. But I think in the end, people are interested in the work on its own, outside of kind of like my face and my existence. And I think that it's the way that the work should live.
But at the same time, those two things inform each other so much in your work, so it's hard to
Yeah.
completely too.
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I want to say that like this is not the case for a lot of artists, but I don't really know for sure. I think some people have a very kind of, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but like a detached practice, a detached way of thinking about their work, where they what is in the studio lives in the studio, and what travels home with them is something different. And I don't know, I think that's It seems maybe like a nice way to work. I don't prefer it, but maybe that's just because that's just not how I operate. I can't kind of divide up my thoughts that way. And I don't know anything else well enough to paint anything else. The thing that I know best is my children and my kind of circumstances and my surroundings, and then the materials that I work with, and trying to kind of outsource what it is that I do and attach that to anything else other than my own history and my own ideas is a really difficult task, because then I'm having to own up to something that's much bigger than me.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I mean, and I think the description that the practice that you're describing of the separate studio from life is I hope I can say this without offending anyone, but it's kind of an old-fashioned way of thinking about art, that
Yeah.
it's detached from our everyday lives when in fact art emerges from the material conditions of life. So
Right.
it's to be honest about that.
Yeah, it's almost very workmanlike, in the sense that, people show up from like 9 to 5 and they clock in, they clock out, and they do their research. And, for me, it's like the research is always, it's constant, it's consistent, and it's very fluid. And whether I'm, painting or kind of like cutting my grass or teaching my kids how to like trim kind of like, the shrubs or whatever it is, like it's all somehow finding its way into not just the material, but like the content and the energy of my paintings. And that's something that you can't clock out of, I mean, and it's not to say that I'm always with my kids and that I'm always kind of like in service to them and they're always with me and that I'm always painting. It's not like, I don't have 10 arms and I'm doing all of these things at once, but I don't know. I feel like there's just like a real blend of energies that are happening that make me kind of more aware, I think, at least for myself, from one moment to the next, how I'm going to integrate it into the painting. I'm not shutting it down and saying like, well, this is me time, and me time means that I'm making art, like all of the time is kind of me time, and all of the time is art time, and all of the time is time to paint and to think, and also not really be too serious about it in a way, where I have, where one shows up to work and they have to put on their work face and their work hat and their work tie and kind of do all those things that work says that you have to do. I'm fortunate that because of where I live in San Antonio, Texas, I don't really have to go anywhere else or do anything else. And I can really just focus on the studio. And I don't really have to report anywhere else other than to like be with my kids and pick them up and hang out. And again, that just feeds directly into the work in one way or another. I don't know if that answered any of your question at all, but
it does. I mean, it lays it lays such a good foundation for understanding where you come from, right? So it's like going from that, like, describing your work as something it's painting, but it also incorporates not like so-called non-traditional materials as well. So like you're talking about, teaching your kids how to like trim the shrubs. In my mind, I'm like, probably there's a piece of that shrub in your work as well. Probably,
oh yeah. Yeah. And it's like, and there's like just getting them to learn how to use tools is a way of kind of like me trying to design a kid that can help me in the studio to paint rope and trim other things that I need trimmed, as a studio assistant when they're old enough. Like right now, like, my two oldest are 15 and almost 14. And, they help out every once in a while, but I can't trust them kind of like with sort of the detailed work. They're just a little bit too lazy right now. And so I kind of have to like, it's like a very like Karate Kid sort of scenario, like it's, if you remember the very first Karate Kid where Mr. Miyagi has, Danielson painting the fence and he's like, what the fuck am I painting the fence for? And at some point, like he's like defending himself using these paint the fence moves. That's sort of that's what I do with myself. And,
right.
And I think that's how I learned how to paint, is by doing other things. But it's also like how I'm raising my kids. And of course, I say it jokingly, I'm not trying to get them to be my studio assistants, but I know that the time that I spend with them doing things has a lot to do with what it is that I want them to be able to do, not just for me, but for themselves. Right. So the whole painting the fence things, I think it kind of rings true when it comes to raising children, is what things can you teach them about kind of just being and living, that when they're on their own in the world, defending themselves or projecting themselves onto the world, or just trying to integrate themselves, how can they use the lessons, no matter how small or big, or seemingly like useless, how can they integrate that into just an everyday practice of being, and that's difficult, I think. And that's scary because, you will almost never know,
It's definitely not a straightforward thing to teach them.
it's not. I mean, you would like to think that it would be, and that you could just tell them once and that they would learn it, and then you can trust that one lesson that you gave them would carry them for the rest of their lives. But it's just not that way. And I think somehow for me, this all relates to painting, is that you can't really kind of be taught any one thing in painting and expect that one or two lessons, those things that you learned, whether it was in school or on your own, you can't let that thing be the thing that carries you forever. And I think it's important for an artist or a person in general to be able to take kind of the lesson as just sort of the foundation of something that you have to build on top of as you keep busy in the studio and as you become kind of in contact with more people, as you're just sort of bumping around the world. You just sort of have to live off of the foundation. So, the foundation is important.
Yeah. And then how do your, just to, keep on the topic of your children too, because I know they influence your work a lot and life. How, do they appear in your paintings, not not representationally, but just like, how does the influence of your children, let's say, sort of slip into your work visually?
Yeah, I mean, in a variety of ways, but I think, first they slip into the work kind of like numerically, right? So like if I'm, with the last show, with the show that's up right now, there's a painting, I forget the title of it now, but it's a dark painting. It's kind of like split in half diagonally. It has a black side and a red side, and it has 3 shells. Excuse me. And, if I paint one shell and I begin to think of that one shell as a relationship to one of my kids or a person, I immediately feel a sense of guilt. And I think, well, I have to do 2 shells. And because I have 3 kids, I have to do 3 shells. And now the painting is suddenly about like all 3 of my children. And, it's in the same way in which, like right now I'm working on a new series of smaller paintings for a show I have coming up. And I'm making a painting that just happens to have something that resembles like a shark fin. And my daughter, Paloma, she's really into sharks. She's obsessed with it. And as soon as I started making that painting and I realized that this was something that was about her, I realized, well, now I need to make another painting about my sons, both of them, each. They now have to have their own individual paintings. I can't leave one out. It's like you can't take your kid to go get ice cream. You have to take all the kids to go and get ice cream, And if you take one on their own, then you have to take the others on their own. And that sort of like strikes a balance within parenting. But for me, it also strikes, it's a way for me to strike a balance within painting. It's a way for me to kind of understand how to use not only what it is that's close to me, but also how to kind of just navigate the mechanics of the painting itself, right? If I know that I'm going to make a painting about my kids and I'm interested in making a painting with shells, I know that there has to be 3 shells. And then now it becomes a question of how do I organize these shells and how do I organize all of the other elements that make up the nature of the painting. Yeah, that's one way to go about it.
Well, that's a really beautiful example and interesting in relation to what you were saying about, learning the skills of painting and then building on that, like how you create your own language. And I guess I'm curious about your approach to painting, if you can sort of describe how you took the sort of lessons and built your own visual language and style.
I think I've always thought about my approach to painting as being a bit haphazard and not really, because of where I started, where I studied. I first started at a community college, and my first painting class was taught by a man who went to the Art Institute of Chicago, studied abstract painting, and basically came back to teach. And really, he just told everybody, buy big buckets of paint and just make big abstract paintings, right? And there were really no lessons outside of that. I mean, he would give us sort of like brief art history tutorials and talk a bit about paintings, but you were always just sort of like flinging paint around and just trying to figure out, like, is this good? Like, I don't know, is this good? And everybody's just looking at each other. Well, I think this is good for this or that reason. And we all just ended up making kind of like really bad abstract expressionist works. I mean, they were terrible, but they were gratifying because it was new. And the sensation of it being new and that drive to do something that felt good, even if it resembled something else, was a powerful feeling to have. And then I went to the University of Illinois, Chicago, and that was a much more conceptual school. And it's, the people that I studied painting with were really not interested, I don't think, in teaching us painting technique as much as they were interested in getting you to understand, what are you doing in the first place and why are you doing it? If you're going to commit 8 hours to a painting for a class or for an assignment, and then you're going to ask everyone to spend an hour looking at it, you sure as hell better be able to articulate what it is that you did for 8 hours and why the hell we should be looking at it for an hour. Right. And so you end up spending a lot of time reading, but also just asking yourself, like, why the hell am I doing this? And that becomes kind of an internal dialogue that you develop. And maybe those are in part defense mechanisms, and in another sense, they're also just ways to legitimize and validate and kind of like comfort yourself that what you are doing is valuable. But there was really no painting technique inside of any of that training. And then graduate school was kind of the same way. You show up the painter that you are, and they're just sort of trying to kind of like help you figure out what that is. And so I think when I started making paintings, early on in college, it was the energy that I used then was just really an energy of discovery. How close, at first it was, how closely can I get my paintings to look like other great paintings? That's always the objective of a student, right? It's like you feel really good when you make something that resembles, like a beautiful glowing Mark Rothko or Jackson Pollock or Marsden Hartley or whatever. Like that feels wonderful. And then at some point you realize that you have to stop copying people and you have to begin to do your own thing. And then you start shutting off, your the people who inspire you, and you end up just trying to kind of venture out and experiment on your own. And I think for me, because I've had very little instruction in painting technique, it became very easy for me to begin to integrate a lot of other things into the format of painting, without questioning whether it was a valid way to approach it at all. It's just, I'm just there doing something that feels right. And because I really consider myself as someone who likes to work with their hands, it became easy for me to kind of integrate wood and rope and rocks and things. And I don't know, I feel like you enter into kind of a different kind of poetic territory when you're not so focused on illusion and you're not so hell-bent on history and you're not so kind of driven by a philosophy that is external to your own abilities with your hands. And for me, it's really a lot about the hands, and it's a lot about kind of like my own position in the world, right? And my position in the world, just like everyone else, is very small. And so why think bigger than like my immediate context? Why think bigger than kind of the very small bubble that I function in, which is to say my family? And so I think my approach to painting has everything to do with just what is it that is in reach, to me right now. Like I can pick up a stone and I can pick up mountain laurel beads and I can pick up cardboard and I can pick up paint and brushes and I can think about my kids and I can think about the trees and the river, and all of these things are reachable. I can either touch them, because they're at arm's length, or I can drive to them or ride my bike to them, or I can run to them, and none of those things are far away. Or I can look up in the sky and I can see it. It's there. I can touch it with my eyes, but I don't really have to go too far to think about what I'm going to make. I don't have to dig into any books, and I don't have to kind of ask anybody else to confirm whether I'm on the right track or not, because it's all just sort of derived from my immediate context.
Yeah, and so there's an authenticity to it that you don't have to like confirm through history.
Something. Not at all. Like I don't need. There's just really no desire at all for kind of confirmation from anybody that what I'm doing is, whether it's on the right track or not. It's just,
Which
it's,
is like what a great space to be in. And I like the way your work has a sort of porous relationship to your local landscape and your life. So just to be more specific, like your paintings will include objects and materials you find around you, which you've touched on.
mhm, mhm.
Sometimes you'll paint them and make them part of the image. So could you
Yeah.
speak a bit about this? Like I like that sort of ability to sort of oscillate between, landscape and art.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think when I first moved back from San Antonio from New York, I was in New York for 3 years. My ex-wife, she was in graduate school. We were there. That's when I first started showing. And then when I came back from New York to San Antonio, we had split up and I was spending a lot more time alone. I was spending a lot more time on the river, going for walks, running, biking, just being outdoors quite a bit. And I also just had a lot more time. And I mean, and there were a lot of other factors too, like my studio space was much smaller. The scale that I could afford to paint on was much smaller. Everything just sort of changed. Like, that just happens in relationships when you get a divorce or you separate from somebody and that you're with for a long time, everything just sort of becomes uprooted. And it's like anything else that you pull up uh, by its roots, you're going to pull up other things. You're going to pull up rocks, you're going to pull up trash, you're going to pull up maybe broken glass, old pennies and nickels, anything that might have been happened to have sunk into the ground at the time of planting or over the course of that thing being in the ground. And I felt like once I was uprooted, there were all of these things that kind of like fell away, but there were also a lot of things that I discovered that I could integrate into the paintings. And I think all of those walks and all of that time spent outside really helped me to figure out not only why I want to paint, but how I was going to paint. And it took a really big turn for me to be able to begin to think about materials as a part of my kind of everyday approach to painting. And going back to what I was saying earlier, where I didn't really have an understanding of technique, illusionistic technique or a really good color sense. I could find a piece of plastic, or I can find a piece of stone, or I can find anything that kind of would sing to me as it sat there in the ground, right? So you can find, it's like seeing a shell and you think, well, there's 1,000 shells, but this one is really beautiful. How can I put this beautiful shell into a painting? But now how can I make the life of that shell also be worthy of having been moved from the sand that it was in and also feel really vibrant inside the life of the painting? Right. And so it becomes like this kind of competition between the painting surface and the shell or the bead or the stone. How can I make this thing kind of sing and be something inside of the painting? And I think that's always kind of what I've aspired to do, is how can I integrate these things, not just for the sake of like, because I'm interested in rocks. At that moment, that rock really, it said something to me. And I really want to understand what it's like to be able to make that thing say the same thing to everyone who sees the painting, right? Because I certainly can't bring everybody to the river bank or to the dirt patch that I was in and say, hey, look at this rock that I just saw. Do you see it? Look how beautiful it is. And once you remove it from its context, it's insignificant. And even if you did bring everybody there, nobody's going to really care. It's like, yeah, it's just another fucking rock. Like, what's the big deal,
Yeah, everyone feel it differently or
yeah,
over.
it's like a flower, it's like, people walk by. I mean, Toronto's filled with gorgeous flowers. When I was there, I couldn't get over it, and it seems like, well, it's, San Antonio is not that way. Like, we have our own kind of like landscape, which is unique, but it's not as fragrant and it's not as kind of like colorful as Toronto was, at least when I was there, just over a month ago or about a month ago. So how do you make that seem like something that you just don't walk by? How can you stop people in their tracks and say, this is a rose and you should look at this rose and you should pay attention to it and smell it and appreciate it and take a picture of it and keep it with you and then move? That's a difficult thing to do, but that's always what I think that's what I want to do, is to kind of make my paintings be and live sort of like a rose. Not something that you're going to necessarily take with you forever, but something that you're going to stop at, appreciate, smell, look at, and then also remember all of the other roses that you saw and like maybe the places that you were when you saw those roses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and then I think that also brings up like how maybe the objects or motifs that come up in your work are sort of have like hybrid representations. You know, they're not meant to
Hmm.
represent themselves or represent an idea necessarily, but more how a shell, for instance, can mean multiple things.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's, I mean, I think this is just sort of the way that we live. You see things, and you pass by places and you see things that remind you of other things or other people or events in your life. And if you live in a city long enough, or if you kind of, I don't know. I mean, if you're just in the world long enough, paying attention, you begin to see things that remind you of a previous life that you lived. And as I drive around San Antonio, I've been here for 8 years consistently now. I can drive around and remember buildings and look into doorways and look in at trees and say, I was with somebody at this moment. I was having a conversation at this moment. At this moment, when I lived in that house, my children were, such and such age. There are all these kind of symbolic markers, and really they're just doorways, and they're just trees, and they're just sort of river bends, and they're just kind of things that you pass by. And I feel like, that because we all do that, why not also do that in painting? Why not let the shell function as a representative of what it is that I am and who it is that I'm with?
Yeah.
A tree or a shell is not going to mean the same thing to anybody else. And, in that sense, painting has to function as a painting on its own outside of my own kind of system of meaning. It has to be relevant in some way and important to somebody
Yeah.
uh, for themselves. But that after that, it's not really up to me. For me, I don't need people to understand why I'm painting things. Uh, you know, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I'm curious. That sort of leads into another question I had for you, just around context, and because your work is so connected to the context in which it's made, and your studio, as you suggested, is
Mm.
larger in San
Yeah.
Antonio than it was able to be in New York, and so your
Oh,
work has sort of expanded in ratio to that. But I'm curious then, like, how does it feel when you go from your studio in San Antonio, which maybe you can describe a bit, but and then to see, your work in a sort of white cube space, which you do very much. What is that?
yeah.
How does that live for you? Like, what does that shift feel like?
It's kind of frightening because it's because I my studio space. I mean, it's I bought an older, smaller property, and I gutted a house and I turned the house into my studio, and it's got lots of like wood finishes, and like it's got like a cedar lined ceiling, and it's open, it's spacious. It's not huge. It's only maybe 900 to 1,000 square feet, but it's sort of a charming space. There's lots of plants. There's lots of I have nice skylights, and there's all of these things that when you walk in, at least for me, I feel really good, and it's a nice space to be in. Though it's a very hot space at the moment because it's I have too many skylights and I'm letting in a lot of heat, and
Yeah.
it's really hot in Texas right now. Um, Anyhow, that's the place where these paintings are kind of are born. They're surrounded by all of these other warm textures and plants, and there's so much life and energy inside that space. And so when I make the paintings and I'm looking at the paintings, I'm also looking at all of these other very charming and warm and kind of like beautiful things. Some of the things that I had nothing to do with, right? Like a fiddle fig is beautiful all on its own. Like it doesn't need I need to water it, but like it's a beautiful plant. Like it's and if you put it in a corner, it's just going to liven up the corner. And if my painting is living next to the fiddle fig as I'm painting it, it inherits some of the energy as it lives next to that fiddle fig. Uh, but if you move it outside and away from the fiddle fig and you put it just kind of in this white cube and you put it on a white wall, you don't know how much of the painting was reliant and dependent on the energy of that plant. And, so there's always that sense of anticipation, is that like in the absence of all of these living things and in the absence of this kind of this curated and crafted space, how is this painting going to live on its own on this white wall? And I would, fortunately, I am always relieved when I get, to the gallery and I hang up the paintings and I think, oh fuck, like thank God, like it's not, like it has a life. It took the energy of the fiddle fig and it brought it with it, like all the way from Texas, all the way to Toronto, like, and it's still alive. Like the painting is still living, but it's a difficult thing to navigate because I mean, I can't off the top of my head, think of like any paintings that didn't really work. I mean, there are some that when I see them in the gallery, they're better, and then when I see them in the gallery, I think, well, it's not as lively as I thought it was, but it also just, its energy is maybe it's just a bit more tame. You just read them a bit differently, but
they're
once
viewed with the with the local context that they came from, it's like, just to go even to our earliest point about like material conditions, it's like it's in there, even though it might read differently or be surrounded by a different context, there's still a sort of DNA to where it was born and how it was born.
Yeah. I mean, and for me, this really, I mean, I cannot help but to think constantly about how this relates to like raising children. It's, you think about, you raise your children and you communicate with them and you try and teach them the things that are important to you, and you just don't know how they're going to live out in the world when they're on their own. And it's very rare that as a parent you get a glimpse of how your people, how your children that you spent so much time and energy with and who have developed a sense of being when they're with you, how they exist in the world without you. And the hope is that when they do go out, that they're good, that they're decent people, that they're well behaved, that they're not out kind of like, I don't know, terrorizing people. I mean, I just got a compliment the other day from a friend who said he ran into my kids at the grocery store and he said they were very polite and very cordial and like really sweet kids. And I was like, thank God. Like, I believe that about my children, but I also know the other side of my children. Like I know how they could be real rascals at times and like, sometimes be really indifferent. They're teenagers. Like they don't really care about the adult world and they shouldn't. And so, when he said that he ran into them and like, that they were like polite, I thought, okay, like
that feels good.
Yeah, that feels good. Yeah. It's like, if you said that, like, and he probably wouldn't have said if they weren't polite, he probably just would have been like, Daniel's kids are little shits, but, that wasn't
nothing.
You wouldn't say anything at all, so the fact that he was able to kind of toss out a compliment to me about them was a good thing. And I think that that's how the paintings should live as well, is that you hope that they're going to kind of survive and live out there in the world and be good and exist on their own terms as individuals. And if someone shoots you a compliment and says this painting looks really good in such and such space, that's a great thing. And if you don't hear anything, well, I don't know. It's better than hearing anything negative, I suppose. I mean, I don't know how often people get negative comments about their paintings, but I'm luckily I haven't gotten any yet.
Well, and I mean, this is such a curator's question, but, I wonder, is there a scenario that you've ever imagined of like exhibiting them in a specific way that would be more immersive? Or do you think that sort of works in reverse? Does it make it a sort of like false sort of context? Is it better to just let them out and be authentic about it?
Yeah, I think for me it's that because they come from such a busy and lively environment, I feel like I can't reproduce that. It would just like I would just be trying to reproduce my studio, and I don't kind of have this large grand vision of what painting should be or what these paintings should be in such a way that I can kind of determine a whole space. Or kind of like bring to life an entire space. Like I really want them to be able to live on their own. Like I'm not trying to raise a cult of paintings in the same way I'm not trying to raise a cult of kids. It's like I just want to like raise individuals and good individuals, and I want them to be like strong and healthy all on their own when they're together, but also when they're apart. And I think trying to make everything a little bit like really cohesive, people have often asked me, are you interested in painting the walls different colors and like sculpture? And yes and no, like that could be fun, but that could also be like, what am I giving and what am I taking away? Do I really need to do this? Can't we just look at paintings on their own
Right.
outside of a lot of the other kind of like decor and orchestration that happens, around larger installations? And that's not to say that I'm completely against it, but it's a much larger vision for painting than I have, because I work on each painting kind of as an individual thing on its own. I don't really think of them like as like clumps of work that say one thing in particular.
Yeah, and I think maybe the best thing you can do in that case in terms of installation in a gallery is maybe it's just, hanging that one work with care, making sure it's in a spot that feels good for that work. And, I mean, and you are a little bit experimental as well in the way you
Mhm.
install things at different heights and
Yeah.
sort of, trying to find a maybe arrangement that feels good for those works. And maybe that's the way that they live.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I just joined a baseball team. I was writing about this morning about how fun it is to have joined this baseball team and not kind of be like the center of the world, like on the
Yeah.
baseball team. Like I'm one of the lesser players, but I'm valued no less. It's like I'm not like, hitting home runs or anything, but I'm still a part of the team. And that's a nice thing. But when you make a team, you have to figure out who is going to be the pitcher. Like, everybody kind of wants to be the pitcher. But not everybody's going to be a great pitcher. Some people are just going to be better outfielders, right? And an outfielder has their own strength. And I think painting is kind of that way too. When you're hanging your show, is that, all right, who's going to be the pitcher? Like sometimes it's really obvious, like I think in my current show now at Cooper Cole, it's, like the Father Time painting, the white painting. Like that's, for me, that's the pitcher, right? That's the painting that kind of like you walk in, it gets the big wall, it gets the most attention.
Yeah.
And I feel like it gets the most love and energy. And that's sort of like maybe the star of the show. And then everything kind of like radiates outside of that, right? You have your outfielders and your shortstop and your second and your third and first baseman, but like on the mound is Father Time. And I feel like, when you're hanging a show, you have to be able to figure out, is this painting better seen kind of at eye level, or does it really deserve to be a bit higher? And is it okay that you're not reading every brushstroke kind of like from a 2-foot distance? It's all right to be a little bit further away,
Yeah, how does it relate to the way you view or how your body exists with it?
Yeah, because ultimately, the hope is that someone chooses to live with these works and that they're going to develop a sensitivity to how it is that those works also exist and how they exist in relation to them, right? Do they want to be so close to it? Is it okay if they're not able to kind of get up and touch it? Or is it something that they need to be able to stand like eye to eye, with, and be able to touch it and breathe on it? Those are all different ways to navigate like how you hang a show, but also how you interact with art, how you interact with painting. It doesn't all have to be kind of like the typical museum experience or gallery experience where everything is hung at eye level. I think sometimes it's nice to have a sense of distance from something where you can't kind of see, like, like the sun painting that's hanging over the door. It's, it's a good 5 feet, I think, above, above where, from where you're standing. And you can't really see the sand, inside of it. You can't really see a lot of the details. I mean, you can squint and you can look, but I think that distance kind of gets you closer. It creates a sense of desire because you can't kind of like bridge that. And so I think when you're hanging a painting, in the same way that you're making a painting, you have to kind of develop a sensitivity to what the distance is going to be and what feels right.
Yeah, and actually that I was just wanting to ask you actually about the sun paintings, the terracotta suns, if you could speak about them. So there's 3 in the show, but it's something you've done before. So it's I don't know, maybe you could speak about that a little bit.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I think I had mentioned, I think in the press release or the statement that we crafted, how these terracotta suns are really, they're common kind of like Southwest, I guess Central, I don't know about South America, but you find them on the facades of, homes. It's a way for people to decorate their houses. And they're really common, and sometimes they're really personalized, and people use they'll use paint and they'll kind of decorate them on their own. And sometimes they'll just buy them from the store as like terracotta forms and they'll just hang them just like that. And for me, it's a form of sun worship. And, because I for some reason cannot really, like none of us can escape the sun, but I cannot escape kind of painting the sun for some reason. I took on the task of trying to paint a lot of them, and then began to think of them as a form of self-portraiture and a way to kind of, I've never painted a face before. Like, I don't think I've ever done like direct portraiture. And I feel like this is the most direct way in which I've actually interacted with the face, and that I've interacted with the body. I don't know. I'm not sure what else to say other than that. It's something that I want to continue to do. I actually want to create my own terracotta suns. I'd like to be able to work with clay and actually not buy suns that are precast, but actually create my own, and then maybe paint the ones I create, and maybe at some point maybe do some bronze suns and maybe scale up a bit. That would be fun. But it's all. Then I have to step away from painting though, and that's always the difficult thing. Is that as much as I want to do things like sculpture, that means that I can't do painting, and it's hard for me not to paint, which is why my paintings are so sculptural too.
Yeah, and there is something to be said for buying them as well, right? That it is the sort of same shape and same foundation that you would find on any house sort of in your area, and that you've just you know,
I like
elaborated on that.
I'm always looking for them, in people's houses, and I like that that I'm interacting with something that other people, that everyone is interacting with, that it's common in that way, and that all I'm doing is kind of giving it another layer of
Yeah.
personalization. It's like a house.
You have it outside of your studio as well, right? Like you're not
Yeah,
even
there's one that's hanging
differently.
Yeah, there's one that hangs outside my studio, and actually that the idea for painting them came from seeing somebody who painted one. Like it was like the one that actually hangs outside of my studio right now, that will always hang there, is more or less a copy of a really weird one that I saw hanging outside of somebody else's house, that had like these big dark green eyes and like this like really kind of like vulgar like spikes, and it's almost too much. It looked demonic. It's kind of frightening when you look at it, but I would always be drawn to it because it was just so weird and so like it was inviting in the way that the sun is inviting. But then you look at the sun, you're like, ah, shit, like don't do that. That's how I felt looking at that person's sun. And I thought, well, I want to do that. Like, how can I create a sense of like, you want to look at it, but you shouldn't look at it, but you want to look at it, so you're going to look at it, and then what do you get? What are the benefits and what are the downsides of looking at the sun? There are many, but it is nice to be able to get them kind of pre-made, and then really not fuss too much about the form that they're going to take. I'm really just thinking about, it's like makeup. I'm really thinking about how can you personalize something in terms of kind of the color that you give it, which is different than like painting on a canvas and kind of like building around a canvas, because it's not so much about the application of paint. It's really, for me, it's a lot more about structure and kind of like integration of materials. And the terracotta suns do that to an extent too, but not in the same way. I don't know, they live kind of on a different level in a way for me. I also like the idea of painting living outside.
Yeah, totally.
Like I love paintings outside. Like right now, the paintings that I'm working on, because it's too hot to work in my studio, I have 10 small paintings that are hanging on my fence, and I just work on them outside. And every once in a while, I'll bring them inside and I'll fuss with them a little bit. And then they spend, like most, like 23 hours a day outside. And they're just hanging on the fence, like just baking under the sun.
I love that.
It's nice to go outside and like see the sunlight actually hit them, and then you bring them in and you think, oh, okay, that like all of the energy that I thought was there was just sunlight. How can I add that energy but with paint? That's the hard part, because it's like you really can't compete, but at least the least I can do is kind of give it some level of effort where I'm trying to capture a sense of like light and warmth and motion and kind of like what it is to be something that grows kind of like under the sun. And the paintings hopefully are doing that. I don't know. It's still really early on in the process of making these, but I love the fact that they're outside sleeping, and
Yeah.
then they wake up with me and they're still outside doing their thing. And I have a few other paintings that are like, I have a painting that's hanging from a tree. It's like a star-shaped painting that I cut out years ago, and it's been rained on, it's been snowed on. It snowed once in Texas, in the last
Oh
20
my
years.
gosh.
Um,
And
it's
painting got it.
Yeah, and it's like it's slowly decaying, but I love the fact that this thing that kind of looks like a piñata is just hanging there from a tree, and it's just sort of like taking on a different life of its own. And I don't ever want to touch it. I just want to let it just kind of like live and die on the tree. Uh,
Hmm. And there are a lot of references to the environment in your work, right?
mhm,
Like you're talking about the sun and snow and everything. So there are materially and also symbolically in your work, there's a lot of reference to the environment and to nature. Um, so yeah, I guess I'm wondering about that night and how that sort of connects with your interest in landscape. And you've mentioned also that you dream a lot about landscapes, and that sort of
mhm.
slips into the work as well.
Yeah,
Can you
yeah,
speak about that a bit?
yeah. I mean, I I feel like when I think about my work in relation to landscape, I think about it in the same way that I think about my dreams in relation to landscape, is that I'm just dropped into a place and I'm in a place wondering about it and thinking about it. And there are things in the landscape that I can identify in the same way that in my dreams, there are things that I can identify and articulate because they have their own symbolic meaning, or maybe I already know it. But I, I I don't have a deep interest in the landscape in that I'm wanting to replicate everything that it is and understand everything that it is, because I enjoy the mystery and the decoding part of it. And I think making myself like, I'm vaguely familiar with like every landscape that I'm in, and I'm incredibly curious about every landscape that I'm in, but I'm not willing to go and do all of the work and the research to find out everything in the landscape that I'm in, because then the mystery just dissolves. And I like to be able to look. It's like if you learn how to read, you look at a word and you can't help but to read it. You see it and then you read it. And I like being able to go out into a landscape and have it be illegible. I like being able to go out and not know everything. It's nice to go and say like, yes, that's a sycamore tree and that's an elm tree and that's a mesquite tree, and like I are able to identify certain flowers and birds and things, but there are things that I just want to kind of leave alone and let it be mysterious, and maybe at some point I'll look it up when the moment feels right. And I feel like that's sort of how dreams function for me as well, is that you if you spend too much time trying to figure out what a dream means, and you do that every single day, then you begin to develop a narrative, and then that narrative begins to overtake and becomes more important than the act of creating and the act of being in a mysterious space. And I like the idea of being in a space that is mysterious to me, that I don't know, that there are places and paths that I'm not going to enter into, uh, because I just don't need to. It's. I think it's a matter of following impulses. What is the right way to go? What is the right way to look up? And what is the thing that I want to understand at that moment? And I think sometimes just being present and in that space and take it all is important, which
Yeah.
is very different than like arriving with an agenda.
Yes.
Uh, and I don't think that my work is kind of agenda based. It's not really. I don't start painting. I don't start any painting with the idea that it's going to be about any one thing. In the same way that I don't go for a walk uh, anywhere with an agenda of doing any one thing or seeing anything in particular. I'm just going, and
Hmm.
it's the movement, it's the action, it's the progress that I'm making with my feet that's important. In the same way that it's the progress that I'm making with a paintbrush or like a piece of wood or rope, that's important. It's the process.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating, and it's really, I mean, because nature is so immense, right? Like I
Yeah.
I like what you're saying about, not wanting to necessarily know everything, or not, maintain some mystery, because it's, when you think about it, you'll never know everything. It's a very colonial idea that you can master nature, right? That you can know
Right.
everything about nature.
Yeah.
And so there's something really valuable in sort of having that self-possession or self-assurance to just say, okay, what is it that's happening right now in my body in relation to all of this?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that really opens you up to kind of experiencing and looking at other things in ways that you haven't seen them before. If you know something too well, then you almost write it off. It's like having family. It's like, we communicate with our families in a very particular way, in a way that we wouldn't communicate with anybody else, right? You might be able to, like, snap at your spouse in a way that you would never snap at anybody else,
Right.
if they kind of rubbed you the wrong way. um I don't know, there's just a level of, like, familiarity that creates, or dissolves rather, a boundary. And I like the feeling, I like the boundary between me and other entities. I like the boundary between me and the landscape. I think there's kind of like an inherent respect in that boundary, and that when it's appropriate, um, I'll educate myself and inform myself, or it will introduce itself to me. And in the same way that you negotiate that kind of relationship with people, you can't just go kind of meeting everybody that you think is interesting. There's a time and there's a place, and sometimes that time never arrives, and you have to be okay with that. Um, yeah, it would just be too much of a task. I think that's a different profession. I think, someone who, studies flowers, obviously, or, like, or is interested kind of like in the river in particular, and like its path, and like what it does and its history. Like, those things are interesting to me, but on the periphery. Like, my obligation is really towards painting. And so if I spend too much time doing anything else, that's a lot of energy to put into other things that have nothing to do with actually making a painting.
Totally. And if I'm curious also about this particular body of work with that's at Cooper Cole right now. The title, Father Time, and you were talking about the
Mm.
white and blue work that's really important to you. Maybe you could speak about what that title means and why these works represent that to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's so for me, it has like a double meaning. One is funny, and the other one is just sort of, it's not really serious, but for some reason, my son, in the last, I would say 5 months, he started calling me father. And which is, for him, it's a way, I think it's a form of control, right? He thinks it's funny.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was funny at first, because they have always grown up calling me papa.
Yeah.
And, I've always liked that, papa, like they, ever since they were tiny, papa, papa, papa. And then at some point he was just like, father, and he doesn't call me papa anymore. He just calls me father. And I was really annoyed by it at first, but then I thought, well, he thinks it's funny, and this is the way that he addresses me, and he doesn't mean it in a mean way. I think it's a way of, like, controlling how it is that he interacts with me,
Hmm.
right? And so, because my kids don't live with me, I the time that I spend with them, I refer to as father time, right? In a joking way, where I do spend a lot of time with them, but it's it's not the same as, like, being able to have your children in your house, where you're kind of like, you're just much, much closer to them. And they haven't lived with me for the last 2 years. So that father time now is really, really important, in a way that when they're living with you, it's not that the closeness of your children isn't important, but there's kind of like a respectable distance when they're in their room and you're in the kitchen, or you're in your room and you're doing your own thing. It's you just know that you're in different places, but under the same roof. And it's, yeah, now that they're away, that father time is all the more important. So that's one side of it. And then the other idea is that father time in relation to the sun being the thing that determines all, for us anyway. It's our star. It's the one that kind of gives everything life. But it's all the thing that it's also what we fight and what we work with, time. It's also what it is that we have and what we use most frequently without even trying, which is time. It's something that we're engaged in constantly. We're always kind of trying to monitor. We're always trying to save it. but we're also spending a lot of time wasting it. It's this thing that inevitably runs out for everyone. And I think there's something really beautiful about that negotiation and that kind of persistence of the sun and that persistence of time that is just eating away at everybody, you know. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I know that maybe that sounds like kind of like a real downer, but for me it's just present. It's, you know, in the same way that the sun is present. Like we just, like in San Antonio right now, it's so goddamn hot and you just can't escape it, you know. And at my studio, because it's so poorly air conditioned, I just like it's such, it brings like such like a burden of like sweat and heat and exhaustion that you just have to learn how to live under those conditions. And you know, yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining too much because I have, you know, my studio is very nice. But anyhow, all of that to say that father time is in relation to the sun, in relation to my kids. And there's a part of it, like a pun, that is funny. And then a part of it that like, that's not funny, you know?
That's fantastic. I actually didn't realize the depth of the title. That's incredible. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much for taking the time to speak. It was incredible to hear your answers and learn more about your work.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all the work. I appreciate the invitation to do it.